I'm not pulling out of the driveway. We all know what that means. It's time for another Drive to Work, Coronavirus Edition. So I've been doing fun interviews, and I will continue today with Jim Lin. Say hi, Jim.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so the question I always ask everybody is, how did you learn to play Magic? And yours is a very interesting story. So how did you learn to play Magic?
So I learned to play from Scaff Elias. I can't remember if this was December of 1991 or January of 1992 anymore, but Scaff and I were working to, we were going to be running a miniatures game at a local gaming convention in Philadelphia. So we were getting together to kind of plan what we were going to do as part of that game. And at the end of kind of our planning, he's like, hey, I've got this cool thing to show you. And he pulled out these two small sets of cards. They were, I don't know, I think maybe 1x2 or something like that. They were teeny. I mean, and he said, this is a game that a friend of mine has invented. I think you'd like it. You should play it. And so we played together. And so that was my introduction to Magic. So
Magic came out in August of 1993. So this is December of 1991. So this is pretty early on, right? Richard's early playtest cards, what you're talking about was he photocopied stuff, right? And then just cut them out?
Yeah, I don't know if he photocopied or if he printed. I mean, all I know was they were on, essentially construction paper, printed black and white, with... I was never involved in making the actual cards, so I don't know how they did it exactly. I would just get cards. I mean, but yeah, there was just, there were these little teeny cards about, like I said, that had a little bit of text on them, and like usually to make it easier to remember what the card was, there was some piece of, like cartoon art or, image that Richard had found somewhere that he put on them. I think in some cases he'd sketch something, that kind of thing, or someone sketched something. I don't know. Like I said,
yeah.
I never was, I wasn't, living down at UPenn, Richard and Scaff at the time. So, I never did. So as a result, I wasn't really involved in the guts of making it, basically, the playtest cards. So.
Okay, so what was early Magic playtest like? What was Magic like in December of 1991?
So early Magic playtesting was really funny. I mean, the way it essentially worked was you got given your starter thing, which was I don't even remember what it was, whether it was like a starter deck plus some number of boosters, but it was essentially you got this big pile of cardboard cards given to you. And then you made your own deck and you started playing people, and we played for ante. And then you could trade. And so, over time, you started with like this really random collection of cards you tried to build a deck from. And then as you played other people and traded with them, your deck got stronger. And we would just get together, either you agree with one person, or there'd be nights where a group would get together and we would just play with each other and play for ante and then trade, and then build decks basically. And then talk about the game afterwards. So.
How did you give feedback? Obviously part of this was for Richard to gather feedback. So how was the feedback given to Richard?
I mean, some of it was in person, but some of it was, trying to remember if it was via email or some kind of like list. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think it was some kind of listserv that we would email into, if I remember right, but I could be wrong on that. It could be just, we had like we just emailed all each other. I don't remember anymore. So
you would have notes.
And then there were some, some get-together show where we talk about stuff. So.
Okay, so how did early Magic differ from what got released in 1993?
I mean, in terms of the rules, it was pretty close. The card set changed quite a bit as we play tested, obviously. And I mean, before Magic came out, I think no one had any sense of how big it was going to be. So we were effectively playing with much smaller card pools than, actually happened in reality, right? I don't remember the exact numbers. Let's just say, though, for argument's sake, because this wouldn't be too far off, that we gave everyone in the group one starter deck and 10 boosters. But we never added cards to the pool at the beginning for a long time, right? And so that was essentially, if there were 30 of us playing, the universe of cards that were being played was 300 boosters plus 30 starter decks, right? So, I mean, it was a very small set of cards that were available to the world, right? So, there was, so common cards there's tons of, you could get lots of them. But, some of the rare cards, there was probably like one copy of it amongst everyone playing the game, right? And so, we just, later on when we were kind of getting ready for the final release of Magic, we knew some cards were too powerful, but, at the time people's mindset was, well, no one's going to buy that many boosters. And so, there are going to be a few time walks out there. It's not like, someone's ever going to get a bunch, more than one in their deck. It's probably fine. Right. And then, as soon as the product actually hit the streets and we were like, oh, that was a bad assumption. Right. We just totally underestimated how much people would be into Magic. And we had kind of completely play tested the wrong environment. Right. We were essentially play testing something much closer to sealed deck play than constructed play when we play tested Magic. So, I mean, like I said, we did do trading, and so it wasn't as limited as sealed deck play, but it was, not very close to true constructed play where people were just like, okay, I'm going to go out and get this exact set of cards and make a deck from it, right? And I'm going to ignore how rare those cards are. If I have to, open a billion boosters or do a ton of trading or, buy singles, that's going to happen. Like, we just weren't thinking about it in that way. And so, the decks were really different. I mean, I think my clearest example of how crazy the decks were is there's a couple of them. I remember having a conversation with Bill Rose where he was talking about his deck, and he was like, I only play things that fly or, are creature kill spells. Everything else is garbage. And then because essentially, this was where we had a good extent of either tempo or character advantage, I pulled out a deck that was basically a bunch of low and medium cheap creatures, but that's all I've been able to assemble, and crushed his deck because essentially, the flying things were too slow to keep up with me. His creatures kill was all things like terror, which was, more expensive than the creatures that I was, or the same cost as the creatures I was playing, and there was no card advantage, right? And so, and then the other really funny example is, in an attempt to show everyone how broken Ancestral Recall was, Charlie Catino assembled a deck that was nothing but islands, merfolk, and Ancestral Recalls. And it was pretty good. It beat a lot of people's decks. Now, obviously, if you have, he had, at that time, Ancestral Recall was a common card, so I think he'd gotten, something like 20 or 30 Ancestral Recalls. Right, by trading, and because people didn't realize how good it was at the time at first, and by playing for ante. And so obviously if you have 20 or 30 Ancestral Recalls, you don't really want to pair it with a bunch of 1/1 creatures. But that was what Charlie did, because it was the easiest thing for him to do. Was like, what else can I put with my Ancestral Recalls? Is I don't want to put too much land in. All right, I got to play some cheap creatures. I think at one point he experimented with, maybe he got a bunch of dual lands or got some and put some Savannah Lions in, the 2/1 creature. So you'd have a 2/1 creature instead of 1/1 creature you try to beat you down with. And he was just trying to show I'm drawing a crazy number of cards. It doesn't matter that my other card is not very good. You just can't handle the fact that I've drawn 3 times as many cards as you have, literally, right? And so, it was just, the decks you look back on, they were laughable. So.
The other thing I've heard about stories about the playtesting is because people were trading, that someone would start hoarding something, and you hear rumors that someone's and that the value of that would start going up because people are like, I know so and so wants it, so I'm going to trade it for more because I know there's more value toward it.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. I was involved in less trading just because most of the playtesters either were students, mostly grad students, or worked at or lived near UPenn. That was not the case for me. I was going to UPenn part-time, but I had a full-time job, and I didn't live near UPenn. I'd have to come down, especially in the evenings or on the weekends, to be there. And so, my training sessions were much lower just because it had to be when we had big group to get together. So, I mostly, so my decks tend to be lower powered because I just didn't have as much access to cards as people, and I was mostly, getting cards by playing for ante, right? And that kind of thing. And, you know, like I described the deck I beat Bill with. One of the advantages of that deck was if I lost a card from it, it was actually, I had another card that was almost as good or was the same card, right? You know?
Yeah.
You know, so like my deck never really got worse. I mean, eventually I started winning randomly some good cards, right? And so then I could build more interesting decks, but it was like this weird deck that like I could never get worse no matter how many games I lost because, you know, I'm losing like, you know, like essentially bears, right? I keep losing my bears, but then I have more bears. And so, you know, another bear goes in there, right? You know, and it just, you know, that kind of thing. So, so, I mean, my experience was pretty different than a lot of the other playtesters because of the fact that I was effectively remote in some ways. So.
Okay, so let's flash forward a little bit. Were you at Gen Con when Magic premiered?
I am trying to remember which is the first Gen Con I went to.
Well, I mean, do you remember being at any of the events when Magic first started showing up? Were you at any of those events?
I mean, I was at a really early Gen Con. I'm just trying to remember if it was the first one.
Well, 94 had the first World Championships. 93 was the introduction of Magic. I don't know if that helps you.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm like, this is the thing I'm trying to remember. A lot of these things have gotten fuzzy in my mind. I kind of believe that I was at the 93 Gen Con, but there's some chance I'm getting it confused with the 94, right? I mean, I know for sure both of them involved crazy, like, this is an issue. The fire marshals are getting involved.
Yeah.
You know, lines near the Wizards of the Coast booth, you know, for people standing in line trying to buy Magic, right? You know, I mean, you know, and well, sorry, I must have been at there in 93, right? Because I guess by 94 Gen Con, I actually worked full time at Wizards.
Yeah.
So, and I definitely went to that one. I definitely went to one as a non-full-time employee. So I was there in 93.
Okay, so what was it like taking this game that you had been playtesting that, right, was this little tiny game that started just blowing up into this big thing, this phenomenon? What was that like?
I mean, it was pretty crazy, right? I mean, it was funny. It was one of those things where, you know, because I don't think people understand how, you know, little money we raised to print Magic. I mean, literally, it was I pitched my college roommates on, did they want to put a little money into Magic? They all said no. And then, of course, like 5 years later, like, man, we should have totally listened to you when you said we should put some money into Magic, right? You know, I put a few $1,000s, which, I mean, looking back on it now, I definitely could have put more, but at the time it seemed like an enormous sum of money to me to put into something speculative, right? You know, you know, of my own money. And it was like literally, you know, we raised just enough money to print Alpha. And then when we sold Alpha, we used that money to print Beta. And then when we print, you know, and so like there was just kind of like pay as you go thing that happened, right? And so it was pretty crazy, right? You know, it was the net result of that was there were massive shortages where it was like, you know, no one can find Alpha because we didn't print very much of it, right? And people really wanted it, right? So.
Okay, so you go from being a playtester. So how did you transition to working at Wizards? How did that happen?
So, I mean, after Magic came out, you know, Wizards approached a group of us. It was most of the Ice Age design group, which was me, Scaphalias, Dave Petty, and Chris Page, to work on Magic, you know, part-time, essentially, right? So we were also living in Philadelphia. Scaff, Dave, and Chris were both grad students. I was both a grad student and had a full-time job. And so we would get together on weekends and do it over email, you know, and, you know, comment on stuff that was coming out, you know, whether it was, you know, updating the rule book or the next card set or, you know, fixing errors that, you know, were in alpha, you know, trying to make what was supposed to be on the card for real, right? You know, that kind of stuff. And so, you know, and pretty quickly it became pretty obvious that this wasn't really working out for either group, right? I mean, like, you know, Wizards understandably wasn't very happy about the fact that, you know, we really weren't spending that much time on it because we didn't have the time, right? You know, so it was like, you know, like in my situation, you know, I'm working a full-time job, I'm going to grad school, and, you know, at the same time, I'm trying to work on Magic, right? And so, you know, I was young, so I probably wasn't getting very much sleep, but I probably still wasn't spending more than 10 hours a week on Magic, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, So it was the kind of thing where, Wizards was kind of frustrated about, I mean, it wasn't like they didn't understand, but it became very obvious to both sides that like this whole part-time thing wasn't going to get it done. Right. And so eventually Wizards approached the four of us, and three of us decided to do it. Chris decided he didn't want to do it, to come out, to move to Seattle and work on Magic full time. Because that's the other thing, is we were all living in Philadelphia, which the coast is obviously in Seattle. So, there was not just that we weren't working full time, it was a 3-hour time difference. It's all over, email, and we're talking about 1993 email, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I mean, I don't want to say the internet wasn't a thing yet, but it kind of wasn't a thing, right? Like, you didn't go to websites in 1993, right? Like, you went to like listservs and stuff like that, right?
Right, it was the Usenet back then.
Yeah, I mean, like it was just nothing like the thing that it is now, where you can imagine having an important group working remotely isn't that crazy. I mean, at the time it was just basically completely insane. So, in the spring of 1994, three of us moved out to Seattle and to work on Magic full time, essentially. So.
Okay, so prior to moving out, you guys actually had started working on a design, right? So Ice Age was the first design you guys worked on, is that correct?
Yes. I mean, and we had actually been working on Ice Age from before when Magic released. Mm-hmm. I have a picture that someone sent me because they had found it in their garage and scanned it from like this big summit we did at UPenn. I think it must have been in like early 1993. And so there's a bunch of us, there's all the, like, essentially all the Philadelphia playtesters plus Peter and Lisa Stevens and a few other people from Seattle in this big classroom at UPenn.
Right, we published that picture in The Duelist 5th anniversary had that picture in it in the article about Magic.
Yeah. And so, and at that thing, we agreed to, like, our plan for Magic, which is laughable when you look at it back, when you look at it now. But we had this, idea of, the first release would come out, it would last for a while, and then we would do a second release. And at the time, we were really thinking that, that would be kind of like a sequel as opposed to an expansion, right? Like, there was going to be the first set, and then like the second set, which was at that time we had agreed it was going to be the Ice Age groups that would basically replace all those cards, right? And you wouldn't play the two of them together; you played them separately, right? And
it was going to be called Magic the Gathering Ice Age, right?
Yeah.
The first set was Magic the Gathering. Sorry, the first one was Magic the Gathering. The second would be Magic Ice Age, right? Is that how it's going to work?
Right, and I'm not even sure if this was. This might have been before we had figured out that we were going to have to call it Magic the Gathering. Okay. Even I don't remember anymore, right? Because that was like kind of a relatively like, oh crap, well, we can't trademark Magic. That's an issue. So what are we going to do, right? To give ourselves a trademarkable name we can protect, right? Like that was I remember that being a late scramble. Like, oh crap, what are we going to do? We got to redesign the card backs because we can't trademark Magic.
Do you know where the Gathering came from?
I think it was some idea of both, like the idea of gathering mana and also gathering the cards. It was some kind of there was some kind of brainstorming on it, and email brainstorming on it, and I think a bunch of ideas got thrown back and forth, and people kind of liked the double meaning of the gathering in our minds at the time, I think. Mm-hmm. But that one's really fuzzy to me. It was definitely one of the like, oh my god, this is something we need to resolve in like the next 48 hours because we're supposed to send stuff to the printer next week, but we have to redo all the card backs, right? Because the this is kind of funny now to think about it, because I'm sure right now I don't know, but I assume that the way Wizards did the cards back is they have a file for the card back they have not changed in ages that just keeps getting reused, right? But at the time, like every card had its own back file, right? Like there was a big grid of fronts and backs, and mm-hmm. Because at the time people were short. Like I actually did some like I'm in not for Magic but for Netrunner. I'm in a file and I'm copying and pasting elements from one card to the other card because they're supposed to be the same in an effort to make them the same. So I'm sure that was how the backs were done too. It was like they had to copy and paste the back file, the back image, across the grid, 121 times. And so it was this big panic. So
okay, so Ice Age was meant to be Magic Part 2, the next evolution of Magic. So how did that come about? What was the how did Ice Age come to be?
I mean, I think, the playtest group had kind of broken up in a couple of different ways. It was partially based on who knew who before the playtesting started, because like Richard was kind of the nexus of this, and he knew people through a lot of different ways. Like the Ice Age group was mostly people he knew from his PhD math program. Mm-hmm. Plus, I knew Scat from college, and so I kind of got lumped in with them. Like, there's another group that was more people that Richard knew from participating in the UPenn Bridge Club, and then I think there's a couple other groups, like where Richard had met people mm-hmm. and discovered they liked gaming just like he did, and so the groups that kind of broken up, based on kind of who knew who beforehand, and also because a lot of times, the way we play Test Magic, it would be like, the group that knew each other would get together, because again, this is before cell phones too. So, it's organizing like, 35 people who don't know each other very well to get together is actually kind of a big pain in the butt, right? Back then.
Yeah. And
so it was mostly like, the four of us would get together a lot because we all knew each other and were socializing anyway. And so then we would just play Magic, right? So each of those groups kind of developed their own philosophy on what they thought made a good Magic set and what was fun in Magic and what wasn't fun. And so, we had kind of formed this group, and, we kind of had some ideas of what would make, a good second set. I think one of the things we had talked about in the big summit was wanting to have the sets feel pretty different flavor-wise, right? And so I forget now where Ice Age came from, but I know it's pretty early on. We were like, oh, we want to do like a cool winter, like, snow set with a lot of very different, feeling cards because of that. So.
Okay. So, and then you worked on Ice Age. How long from the beginning of Ice Age to the end of Ice Age? How long did you guys work on that?
I mean, it was years, I think. I mean, so Ice Age got published when, like, 95.
Or
95?
Summer of 95.
I mean, I am certain that we started working on Ice Age informally as early as 92. We probably didn't really formally call it Ice Age and, really get serious about it until, after that summit in 93. So it was at least a couple years we were working on it. But we had been meeting as a group and talking about what we thought was good and, exchanging card ideas for probably 6 months to a year before that, so. Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any favorite stories or just of the making of Ice Age?
I mean, I'm trying to remember. Making of Ice Age, I mean, it's funny. I have mostly stories that are funny because we did a bad job, right? Like, I mean, I think the couple, and then I guess I have one funny story. Like, I remember that. I mean, this kind of shows you how tired we were and how young we were and how giddy we were in these late night sessions. Like, one of my definitely fun stories is remembering the night where we were like, we came up with a Lurgoy, and like there was like a good 20 or 30 minutes of Hans, run! It's the Lurgoy when we thought of that flavor text, right? Just going back and forth with each other and coming up with crazier ways of saying that and just being like. But then I remember like we spent all this time designing that terrible card that. I mean, basically the mechanics didn't fit on the card, and so I don't think the card ever really worked. This was kind of probably one of my pet projects, so I definitely need to take most of the blame for this. Although I don't remember if this ended up being an Ice Age or in Alliances.
Which one?
I'm trying to remember what the card finally got called. It might have just been called Ice Cauldron when it got released. I think
Ice Cauldron, yes. More complicated. Ice Cauldron, yes.
We had some much more complicated name for it, based on like that was based on some mythology we had found, right? I think, and then like with the Ice Witch and stuff like that. But then, so we had something much longer as the name, but then it didn't fit, and also, by the time Ice Age came out, the kind of the brand team, or well, it wasn't really the brand team then, but the group in charge of naming and flavor text was trying to, strip out references to Earth, essentially, right? And so some of the stuff that we named things on just got removed, right? So
how much were you influenced by like Scandinavian type? That seems like there's some Norse and Scandinavian, and some of that was woven.
Yeah,
there.
I mean, we definitely. Well, some of us were pretty into that stuff, and so we definitely were looking into that area, right? And for inspiration on card ideas, just like for Arabian Nights, Richard obviously had looked at at the actual Arabian Nights, right? We definitely, and there's a lot of classic mythology in the original Magic, right? So we definitely were looking into that area. I mean, so Lyric Wife, I kind of feel like that name is either like an actual like Scandinavian monster, or like we took an actual Scandinavian myth and modified it slightly. I mean, like, but it was inspired by something, like some Grendel like thing up there, basically, So
yeah,
like there, and there was quite a bit of that, in terms of designing early Magic sets.
So real quickly, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to hit. There's a few other sets that you worked on. So one of my favorite sets of all time, you guys designed, which was Antiquities. So I just want to talk a little bit about the making of Antiquities. How did Antiquities come about?
I mean, I think Antiquities came about because, essentially early on, we kept underestimating how much demand there would be for Magic and how many new sets we did. So, the original set came out, there were some reprints, Richard did Arabian Nights, and that thing flew off the shelf. Some people were like, we need another set. And so I mean, maybe I remember wrong, but I think we designed Antiquities in something really crazy short, like across 2 weekends. Because it was like, we need another set designed by X day. And, and so like, I think the four of us pulled like 2 all-nighters across 2 or 3 weekends and came up with the outline for Antiquities, and we had a little more time to kind of flush it out into actual cards. I mean, and so we really like the idea of, doing something centered around artifacts. Artifacts, seemed really popular to us in terms of what people liked. There weren't that many in Alpha, right? And so we kind of felt like this is a cool space to explore in. We created some pretty fun story stuff with Urza and Mishra and the Brothers' War and stuff like that. So, I mean, like...
How did that come about? How did you guys come up with the Brothers' War? How did that...
I mean, it was one of those weird things where, there was an Urza card and a Mishra card in Alpha, and we noticed some weird patterns. I mean, like, eventually, Urza had 2 sets of glasses and Mishra had nothing, right? And so we eventually had this running joke, which never really made it into the flavor text, but we put some oblique references in, I think, that essentially they were like, twins, except Urza got both heads and Mishra had no head was our running joke. And so you see like these things where like Urza keeps having 2 sets of headgear and Mishra never has any headgear, right? So that was like our silly running joke was like, Urza got both heads, right?
Yeah.
So.
And one of the cool things about it was you did this archaeology thing where it wasn't that the story was happening, is that you were digging up things, learning about the story that happened long ago. How did that idea come about?
I mean, I think that was, inspired by the idea of artifacts themselves. I mean, the name itself implies that these things are kind of from a lost age. They're not new, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we really leaned into that idea of, I think maybe I'm attaching something after the fact to it, but I think that was Richard's original vision for artifacts, was these were kind of like lost relics, and that's why there were so few of them in the original set, right? And so, I mean, there's some balance reasons you don't want to go too crazy with artifacts, obviously, just because since they're colorless, they go into any deck in some ways, and so you have to be a little careful about, how many of them you do. But so I think we really were just trying to lean into that whole, discovering lost relics. I'm sure in the back of our minds we had some, Indiana Jones getting through the temple, getting the, discovering all the cool stuff thing in our minds, right? So.
Well, that's cool. So, I'm almost to my desk here, so we have to wrap up. So, are there any last thoughts as looking back on your time on Magic? Any final thoughts about sort of what you remember of that time period?
I mean, obviously, I'm really proud of what we created with Magic. I mean, it still amazes me how much we got wrong, but it was fine because we got the most important things right.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't think we can take full credit for that. Some of that, a little bit of that is luck, but I think there is quite a bit of design in there. Like, I think at the heart of it, we did kind of understand what made Magic a great game and preserve that part of it. Even if we got lots of the details wrong, whether it was the timing rules or, how we worded the cards originally and stuff like that, right? So.
Okay, well, it's fun. One of the things I enjoy talking to people that from way back when is just, I've been involved with Magic for a long time, but you predate me, so hearing some of the super early stuff is always fun for me. So anyway, I'm now at my desk, so we all know what that means. It means it's the end of my drive to work. So instead of talking Magic, it's time for me to be making Magic. So thank you, Jim, for joining us.
It was great being here. Thank you.
And guys, I'll see all of you next time. Bye-bye.